The most valuable aspect of Emacs is the ability it gives you to customize your environment and workflow perfectly for whatever it is that you want to do. This is the first video in a series where I'll show you how to build a complete Emacs configuration while also teaching you what you need to know about Emacs Lisp, the language used to configure Emacs. So let's take a look at how you can quickly get started customizing Emacs using the functionality that comes in the box. And click like on the video if you're excited to get started. So in this video, I'm not going to show you how to install or use Emacs. If you're a new Emacs user, I've already made a video about this called the Absolute Beginner's Guide to Emacs, where I give a very thorough introduction on how you can get started, basically how to use the editor, how to install it, what the basic key bindings are, the sort of basic concepts of the editor. So definitely check that out if you are new to Emacs. But if you are sort of, intermediate level or already, an established Emacs user, then this video will be helpful to you. So I'm also going to assume that you've already got Emacs installed and you're using at least Emacs 27, which was released last year, which means that it should be available in most places. However, much of what I'm going to show in this series is actually going to use features in Emacs 28, which isn't fully released at the time that I'm recording this. So if you can't find a recent build of Emacs 28 for your operating system or your Linux distribution, check out the link to the show notes in the description of this video, and I'll give you links to some places where you can go to figure out how to build Emacs 28 from source. I may also make a short video about that as well, just to help people along whenever they have to do this for the first time. So as we go, I'm also going to give pointers on alternative ways to get some of the same functionality that I'm talking about for Emacs 28 using earlier Emacs versions. So don't worry if you can't get Emacs 28, we'll still be able to do a lot of the same things I'm covering in this series. So where is the configuration for Emacs? The primary way to configure Emacs Lisp is to edit the configuration file, which is written in a language called Emacs Lisp. This means that your Emacs configuration is actually code, which is pretty cool. But don't worry if you're not a programmer or you're not really familiar with writing code. I'm going to explain everything, and it actually will be a good starting point for you to learn how to code a little bit. So here are the places where you might find the main configuration file to Emacs. There's the old locations, which aren't really used as commonly anymore. The home directory /.emacs or .emacs.el. These are individual configuration files where you can have all your configuration for Emacs inside of it. But over time, the pattern changed to where you have a folder for Emacs configuration instead, like a specific folder. So more commonly, you'll see this .emacs.d folder in your home directory, and then a file inside of it called init.el, which is the initialization file for Emacs. This is the main configuration file where all of the, well, I guess this is the first configuration file that, it is the main configuration file where a lot of the stuff that you want to write as part of your configuration will go. This is the place where I recommend putting your configuration if you're on Mac OS or Windows, though on Windows, this path may need to tweak a little bit. I might change this show notes just a little bit to put the proper path if it's different. And on Linux, there's a slightly different path you could use. I mean, you could probably use this on Mac OS and Windows too, but it's really more appropriate for Linux because this .config/Emacs folder follows the Linux desktop environment guidelines for configuration. So if you go look in that .config folder on a Linux system on your in your home directory, you'll see that there's configurations for lots of other programs there. And this is just a more organized place to put configurations for individual programs, unlike what people used to do in the past, which is throw everything into the home directory. So definitely put your config in .config/emacs/init.el on Linux systems. And whenever Emacs starts up, it's going to look for a configuration file, typically init.el, in each of these locations to start the initialization process. And it typically does not exist by default. So you're going to have to create your own config file whenever you start Emacs the first time. It doesn't need one if you don't have a config file. It just starts up with all the default configuration. But when you start wanting to configure Emacs yourself, you will have to create your own init.el file. So what we'll have to do is use the Control-X, Control-F key binding for the find file command to open this file for editing. So I'm going to go ahead and start up an Emacs session here. And then I'll use Control-X, Control-F to open a init.el file. And now we're just basically in a blank init.el file that doesn't have anything in it yet. If I were to close Emacs and start up Emacs again, we still, everything will load just fine because the init.el file doesn't have anything in it yet. It's waiting for us to add things to it. So be aware that I'm editing a different init.el file than the places that I'm telling you about because I'm trying to keep this demonstration config separate from my actual main Emacs configuration, because if you haven't noticed already, I'm actually in Emacs right now. I'm running Emacs within Emacs. So just make sure that you put your init.el in one of the locations that I mentioned above. specifically .emacs.d or .config/emacs, the init.el file in both of those places. So the basics of configuration. Now that we've got our init.el file created, let's learn how you can actually configure Emacs with it. The two most common things you're going to want to do in your init.el file are configure features by setting variables, or enable or disable features by calling functions. And I'll give you examples of both of these. So let's take a look at how you would set a configuration variable, and then we'll break down the syntax so you can understand Emacs Lisp a little bit better. So we're going to use this line here as our first example. It's basically set Q, inhibit startup message T. We'll explain what each piece of this means. So this is a list expression, and you can tell that this is a list expression because it's wrapped in parentheses. And this is sort of one of the defining characteristics of Lisp languages. We're not going to go into details on that. If you want to learn more about what Lisp is, go look it up on Wikipedia. There's a lot of information over the years about what Lisp is. Just it's good to know that Emacs Lisp is a variant of the Lisp family. So this represents a call to a function called setQ. So an expression, we're talking sort of higher level here, expression is a unit of code that can be evaluated to produce a result. So it can be a symbol like setQ or inhibit startup message. It could be a value like T or a number or a string, or it can be a larger construct like a list. So these are all expressions that can be evaluated to produce some result. Now, a list is an ordered collection of expressions. So right here we have a list, and this is basically an ordered collection of 3 expressions inside of it: set Q, inhibit startup message, and then T. And each of these things get evaluated to come up with a total result for what this Lisp evaluates to. So a list can contain any other type of expression you would normally see in Emacs Lisp. It can contain symbols, strings, numbers, everything else, and also it can contain other lists inside of it. So a lot of times you'll see Emacs Lisp code with lists that just keep going inside of each other all the way down, and you have a whole line of closed parentheses at the end of your final expression. That's just one of the things that you get used to whenever you use lists or Lisp, but you'll get used to it and you'll learn to love it, I think. So a function is a higher level unit of code that has a name and accepts a certain number of inputs. So when you call a function by name and provide inputs, the code in that function executes and then applies some kind of change to Emacs. So in this case, setQ is the name of the function that we're calling, and then the remaining 2 items in this list are the inputs to that function. So the first input is the inhibit startup message variable, which what we're saying is we're trying to set this variable to some value. And then the T is a value meaning true. So it basically just says we're setting this variable to something meaning true. There's also a nil value, which stands for false. So it's NIL, which is a little bit different if you're used to other languages. And you're going to see these 2 values a lot in Emacs configuration because they basically define whether something is true or false or on or off, that kind of thing. So then variable and function names in Emacs are typically composed of the form sum-variable-name or sum-function-name, lowercase words separated by hyphens or dashes. And this is just something that you will see a lot, so it's good to know sort of what you're looking for when you're looking at function and variable names. And then any line starting with semicolons is a comment. Typically, you see them with 2 semicolons at the beginning of the line. These are non-evaluated lines, meaning they don't evaluate to any result. They're basically just ignored. But they're typically used for writing notes in your code. So if you want to describe some piece of code in your configuration, then this is what you use to do that so that you know what you did and you can come back to it later to understand what you did. So a single semicolon also works, and you can also use it at the end of any line. So if you look here, I have one line here that has 2 semicolons with some string here that doesn't get evaluated. And then this line also has a comment at the very end that also doesn't get evaluated. So they basically just get ignored. So let's try this out. Let's put this line in our init.el file and then save it with Control-X, Control-S, which saves the current file. And then we can restart Emacs to see what happens. So I'm going to launch Emacs one more time here. And what we're going to do is set a variable that makes this welcome screen go away. We don't really need this anymore if we're sort of getting used to using Emacs. It has some helpful stuff, but let's just make sure it doesn't turn on next time we want to turn Emacs on. So I'm going to open up init.el again, and then I'm going to do setQ, inhibit startup message, and I'm going to set that to true. So we're trying to inhibit the entire startup message. I'm going to use Control-X, Control-S to save the buffer. And I want to point out one thing here. This is something special in this base configuration that I'm using. there's this little green box here on the mode line toward the bottom of the screen that tells you exactly what key bindings I'm using to type or run commands inside of Emacs. So keep an eye on this little green box here to see the key bindings that I'm using. I don't know who just subscribed to the channel right now. And it also tells you that I call these save buffer commands. So if you watch that, you'll see a lot of things I'm doing here. So I'm gonna go ahead and close out Emacs, and I'm gonna start it up again to see if that change went into effect. So I'm gonna use my little command to launch that. And now we don't see that welcome screen anymore. It just drops us straight into the scratch buffer, and we're ready to go with Emacs. All right, so it wouldn't be great if you had to restart Emacs every time you change your configuration file. That would get boring really fast. So luckily you can evaluate parts of your configuration while Emacs is actually running. So let's set another variable to test this out. And while we do this, I'll show you one more detail about the setQ function that is important for config organization, which is that you can set more than one variable in the same setQ call. So if we take a look at this example here, we have this call to setQ. We're setting two variables here. There's inhibit startup message T and then visible bell T. So you can basically just put pairs of variable name and value all the way down, just any number that you want in a setQ call. But you don't have to do it that way. If you want to separate the setQ calls, you can also do that as well. It's really just a matter of how you want to organize your configuration. Typically, if you're setting related variables together, you might as well put them in the same setQ. So let's jump back into our Emacs config, and we'll set that visible bell. Let me show you what that's supposed to do before I actually set it up. So I'll go back into init.el here. And when I'm using the arrow keys, you can see down in the green box here, I'm using arrow keys. If I press up here at the first line in the file, it doesn't really do anything, doesn't make a sound, doesn't give me any kind of notification that I'm doing something that I shouldn't be able to do. But if we go and set that visible bell to T, then what I can do to evaluate this expression to make it active right now in Emacs is run the key binding Control-Alt-X with my cursor somewhere inside of this expression. It could either be at the end or it could be inside of the parentheses. If I use Control-Alt-X, which you can see down here, eval defund after I've run it, it evaluates this whole expression here, the setQ and everything inside of it, just whatever your cursor is inside of at that moment, and makes it active currently. So if I now press up, I start getting flashes in Emacs whenever I'm pressing up because it's telling me, oh, you can't do that. So we can also go back and turn this back off again if we want to. We can set it to nil and then use Control-Alt-X again. And then if I go and start pressing up again, that flashing goes away. So it just shows you that you can reevaluate while Emacs is running any bit of configuration to see those changes without having to restart it, which is great. And yes, let's save the buffer here. All right, and I think that's everything for this slide. So if you don't like the flashing behavior of visual bell, just leave it out. It's set to nil by default, so you won't see that. But if you do like what you saw there, set it to T in your configuration and see how it goes. So many features of Emacs are controlled by something called modes. And a mode is basically a collection of functionality that can be applied either to a single Emacs buffer or to the entire editor at once. And some modes are enabled by default in Emacs and others must be turned on explicitly. And you can turn modes on or off at any time by calling the modes function by passing the value -1 to turn it off or +1 to turn it on. This is sort of like an older Emacs convention. There's other ways to do it too, but this is the way that you most often see it in people's configurations. So we have a little example here of turning some things off and turning another mode on. So we're going to jump into Emacs again and just run these directly, and I'll show you what they do. So first thing we can do is turn off this toolbar here. So we have this toolbar that has a few icons. Oh, let me jump into init.el. So we can turn off this toolbar that has icons here by saying tool-bar-mode -1. So toolbar mode is turned on by default. And if we use tool-bar-mode, which is a function to manage the toolbar mode, if we pass it -1, it should turn that off. So now when I use Control-Alt-X, keep an eye on the toolbar here. Control-Alt-X, then it makes that toolbar go away. And you can do that while Emacs is running. Same thing for the scroll bar mode. If we set that to -1, there's a scroll bar here on the right side of the screen. It's kind of hard to see, but if I use Control-Alt-X, it disappears. Same thing for the menu bar mode, -1. And then whenever I execute that, this menu bar here at the top is also going to disappear. So it's easy to turn on and off certain things in Emacs specifically the visuals or any other kind of functionality that you see by turning modes on or off. There's another one that you probably will want to know about, which is the global display line numbers mode. We'll want to turn that on, but use Control-Alt-X. Now you'll see that we have line numbers in this buffer. So it's very helpful for editing code files, which is probably something you're going to do a lot of the time in Emacs, or text files, anything else like that. So that basically just shows us how if you set these lines, then it configures Emacs by running functions for modes. Now, if I were to close Emacs and then start it up again, then you'll see that those same things that I already did are still in effect because they're saved in the configuration file. And whenever Emacs loads, it evaluates all this code to turn those modes on or off as I requested. Now, one thing I will say is that if you are more like a beginner to Emacs, I would leave menu bar mode on by default because it does have some helpful properties. I think I talk about that some inside of the Absolute Beginner's Guide to Emacs. It's useful for learning key bindings, etc. So you could turn off toolbar mode and scroll bar mode to have a more minimal appearance, but I would leave menu bar mode on at least until you get more comfortable with Emacs. All right, so now setting the theme. Another way to configure certain parts of Emacs is by calling individual functions. And there are a ton of functions that you can call in Emacs, and we're going to cover a lot more of them as we go along in the series. But one function you're definitely going to want to call is load theme, which allows you to, you guessed it, load a color theme. So we're going to try loading a color theme called Modus Vivendi, which is something that's built into Emacs 28. It's a really nice theme. It's very customizable. But if you don't have Emacs 28, you should also try this deeper blue theme because it's also very nice, but it is not quite as customizable, or really it's not customizable at all by default. So we're going to talk about visual customization in a later video. So don't worry if we don't show too much about this here. We're just going to show running this function, this load theme function, to show that calling functions is another way to customize Emacs. So I'm going to go here at the bottom of the config, type in load-theme. I'm going to use single quote modus vivendi t. Now what's happening here is that we're calling the load theme function. We're passing it in modus vivendi, but we're using the semicolon at the beginning, which is sort of a specific thing to Lisp syntax, where the semicolon means don't evaluate this name to try to get a value out of it. Just treat it as if it's a name itself. So we're looking for a theme named modus vivendi. And the T at the end here basically says, don't ask me to confirm if I want to load this theme. I'm telling you I want to load it, so just leave me alone. So I'm going to use Control-Alt-X here to execute that. And now we see that this theme is loaded up. Same thing for deeper blue. We can say deeper blue here, Control-Alt-X, and then load that as well. And either of those are very nice to use, but Modus Vivendi is a nice starting point if you want to do some more customization on your theme at a later time. So if you are using Emacs 27 and you want to try out the Modus themes, there is documentation at the Modus themes website about how to install those on Emacs 27 and lower. And also there's more information about customizing the Modus themes, which is actually a great way to practice some of the stuff we're going to talk about in this video. There's a lot of variables you can use to customize how the theme looks to make it look better or more to your taste. And the author of these themes is Prat, who is very well known in the Emacs community. So I definitely would recommend for you to check out his Emacs channel as well, because he talks about the Modus themes and a lot of other Emacs related things. So if you're watching this video, you're probably going to be interested in Prat's channel also. So how to find more things to configure. The two most useful functions in Emacs when you're learning how to configure it are describe variable and describe function. And those are bound to Control-HV for variable and Control-HF for function. Control-H is like the help key map in Emacs. So you're probably going to learn more about that later, more useful things that you can use inside of that prefix. So describe variable shows documentation for any variable in Emacs, and describe function shows documentation for any function in Emacs. And there's also a function that's the best of both worlds, which is describe symbol, which is bound to Control-HO. And that will give you documentation for any name, whether it's a function or a variable or a macro. Sometimes the only place you can find documentation for a particular symbol is inside of describe symbol. So it's good to know about that one as well. So when you run these functions, the prompt is going to be filled automatically with the name of the variable or function that's at the cursor where you are in the current buffer. So if you're typing out some configuration and you want to know more about a particular variable that you're setting, you can use Control-HV, and then describe variable will give you information about that particular variable. So if we were to go to inhibit startup message here and type Control-HV, which you can see down here that I pressed that, And this prompt at the very bottom of the screen, describe variable, it says default inhibit startup message. So it picked up the fact that our cursor was on inhibit startup message there. If I press enter, it gives me the documentation for inhibit startup message. It says its value is T, non-nil inhibits the startup screen. This is for use in your personal init file, blah, blah, blah. So it basically gives you details about what that variable is, what values it accepts, and why you might want to use it. So it's very useful for figuring out new things you can do in Emacs to configure it. If you want to close this window, you just press the letter Q inside the window and it will make it go away. Same thing for functions. If you go to, let's say, load theme and press Control HF, it will say load theme here, but you could also type anything you want. So if you want to type in toolbar mode, you can press the enter on that and it gives you information about toolbar mode as well. So by default, it will just pick up whatever you have your cursor on. Otherwise, you can type in whatever name you want to get documentation for a function or a variable at the point. So also, another useful property of these functions is that you can get completions inside of those prompts. So let me pull up Emacs one more time to give you an example of that. So if I go into, let's say, I'll just go right here because my cursor currently is on nothing. I'm going to press Control HF and I type in scroll hyphen and then press tab. What happens is it's going to give me a list of all possibilities for anything starting with scroll dash. This is also another way that you can easily find things you might want to know about to customize or functions you might want to call in Emacs. You can just type in any concept you can think of, like let's say tab dash, and then press tab. And it gives you many, many options for things that you might want to look into. So you can just go through Emacs all day using describe function or describe variable and just exploring and seeing what type of variables around, and also following some of the links that are in those help panes that show up because it will link you to other variables and files, etc. You can learn so much about Emacs just by looking at this stuff without having to go into the manual or even go looking online. And also, one last thing I want to mention is that while you're typing inside of this buffer, you can actually type in something like load-t and use Control-Alt-I to get a completion for the thing at the point. Or even if you're at load dash, you can use Control-Alt-I and get all the possibilities for load dash in the functions of Emacs. So even in the buffer, you can use this completion functionality to learn about things that you might want to use. And if you were to say, okay, load average, Control-Alt-I, then you can just use Control-HF on load average to figure out more about what this, excuse me, what this function does. It's another way that you can explore and figure out what functions and variables are available to you for customization in Emacs. I'm going to say no to this. Excuse me. All right. So now it's your turn to experiment with what you've learned in this video. So here are a few things that you might want to do to experiment and try this stuff out. First of all, try running HL line mode or blink cursor mode and see what those things do for you. You may like them, you may not like them, but just try it out and see what happens. Also, use describe function and describe variable on those two things, HL line mode, cursor blink mode, to get more information about what they do. You might be surprised to see that describe function and describe variable both have documentation for those two symbols. So just take a look at that and see what happens. Also, go into buffers like we just showed and explore variables and functions by typing in a particular word like indent and then press Control-Alt-I to see what comes up afterward. You might be able to figure out some new things you might want to customize just by doing that. And also, like I mentioned before, if you have the Modus themes installed, try setting some of the configuration variables that are mentioned in the documentation to make the theme look more like what you want. But I'm going to show you a better configuration for that in a later video when we start talking about configuring the appearance of Emacs. So you don't have to spend too much time on that if you don't want to. I'll go into a little bit more depth on that later. So when you try what I showed you in this video, let me know in the comments how it went. I'm very excited to see what people are able to do after they start learning how to configure Emacs. So make sure to subscribe to the channel to be notified whenever the new videos for this series come out. And until next time, happy hacking. We'll see you.